In 1821, William Spencer Cavendish, the 6th Duke of Devonshire, saw for the first time a butterfly orchid. Enamoured, he paid £100 on the spot for it. That's around £15,000 in today's money. Many see this as a kick-off point for a phenomenon which would come to be named Orchidelirium. Throughout the 1800s, exotic orchids from distant lands became highly sought after in aristocratic British homes. In dreary old England, these plants, born in the tropics, were hard to come by, and even harder to keep alive after you did get your hands on one, and that made them all the more exciting. Imagine the rarest and most expensive trading cards you could collect today, slowly withering away in their slabs if they weren't maintained in a certain way. Add to that the way to maintain them was largely a mystery at the time. That's the situation we're talking about. So to have in your possession at the time a beautiful, limited edition, grade 10 orchid, as it were, was a big deal. These exotic plants became a sort of status symbol, both pleasant to look at and a way for the rich to display their wealth. And this demand is what sent orchid hunters to faraway jungles and rainforests in search of their prize. We can read tales of these hunters fighting with the elements, the local wildlife, the people whose land they were trespassing on, and other orchid hunters, all in the search of this elusive flora. Some came back with Wardian cases full, others simply did not come back at all. All the while, back in England, the prices soared. As the century went on, the popularity of the orchid only grew, with some people leaving their plants in their will to their next of kin.
Well, they're orchids, aren't they beautiful?
However, about 100 years after William Spencer Cavendish, the 6th Duke of Devonshire's purchase, the price of orchids would plummet. And today I can purchase a butterfly orchid, the same type that so entranced the Duke, for closer to £50. So, what happened to this blooming market? If you'd give me around 30 minutes of your time, I'd love to briefly tell you the story of Orchidelirium. It's a fascinating tale of morally questionable explorers, well-meaning nurserymen, and, frankly, rich people with more money than sense. And I think it holds an intriguing mirror up to the world of modern collectibles, which I'll talk a bit about too. Oh, and also, midway through researching this, I found a connection to an ancient Greek god, and that itself is a really bizarre story, which I'll also tell you. So, we've got a bit of something for everyone. Alright, that's the seed planted. Let's get into it. William Swainson was born on October 8th, 1789, to a fairly well-to-do family. As he writes in the small autobiography at the end of his book, Taxidermy with the Biography of Zoologists, quote, "At the early age of 14, my education, in fact, from unavoidable circumstances, was left unfinished. An impediment of speech resulting from a particularly nervous temperament acted as an insuperable bar to the acquisition of languages, and I showed not the least aptitude for the ordinary acquirements of school. And so, when others of his age and standing were entering college, he instead entered public life as a junior clerk. In his words, he was wayward and unhappy at this time. He had, however, developed an interest outside of work. His father's collection of British insects and shells ignited in him a passion for natural history. As he wrote, "Every moment I could command was divided between drawing and collecting. It was in vain that my parents endeavoured to repress this ardour and to make these tastes subordinate. Their judicious restraints only increased the evil. Sleeping or walking, my thoughts were constantly bent on how I could get abroad and revel in the zoology of the tropics." His father, seeing where his passions lay, managed to procure for him a military job in the Mediterranean. He worked in Sicily, Greece, Malta and Italy, where he spent time observing and drawing the local wildlife. After 8 years, he headed back to Liverpool in the autumn of 1815. In his words, "I was only 26, and through the powerful interest of my family connections, certainly not from my own merit, I had risen to a rank somewhat unusual for so young a man. I sighed for my Sicilian cottage. I longed again to ramble over mountains clothed with luxurious plants, to sketch delightful scenery, to rise with the sun, gallop on the sands, climb precipices, and swim in the sea. In place of this, I had to join dinner parties, drink wines I detested, ride in carriages, dance at balls, and do 100 other things for which I had neither health nor inclination. Domestic society I truly enjoyed, but that was not sufficient to keep me at home. I had therefore no sooner returned to England than I began laying plans for quitting it." And so he headed to Brazil in hopes of finding flora and fauna not yet documented in British textbooks. And boy, did he. No sooner had he arrived in Brazil than the 1817 revolution of Pernambuco broke out. So his plans of travelling the continent changed, and he instead decided to travel around the east coast of the country. In Rio, he met with famed German naturalist and explorer Georg von Langsdorff, amongst other scientists. And he writes, "With Langsdorff I made several excursions, and in 4 months so enriched my collection that I became almost satiated. I felt I had now more than enough to study and arrange for years to come. I therefore broke up my party, embarked for England, and once more, like a bee loaded with honey, returned to my father's house." There is an apocryphal story about what happened next, which I will tell you before letting you know what probably actually happened. In a book written 75 years after the fact, titled About Orchids, A Chat, by Frederick Boyle, the author writes, quote, "It is commonly told in books that Sir W. Jackson Hooker, Regius Professor of Botany at Glasgow, begged Mr. Swainson, who was collecting specimens in natural history, to send him some lichens. And he did so. And with the cases arrived a quantity of orchids which had been used to pack them. Less suitable material for dunnage could not be found. The orchid arriving in such humble fashion proved to be Cattleya labiata." So basically, the commonly told myth was that Swainson was sending a plant cutting back home and had grabbed some random shrubs to use as packaging material, not realising what he was actually grabbing was unbloomed orchids. And when the parcel was opened back in Britain, the so-called shrubs had bloomed. And a beautiful, unexpected, never before seen in Britain orchid peeked its entrancing face out of the package. The truth probably involved less serendipity. As written by Brian Milligan for the Orchid Society's Council of Victoria, unfortunately Boyle was prone to exaggeration, if not fabrication, and it is now known that some of the material in his stories was pure invention. For example, in an article, The Lost Orchid, about the Cattleya labiata discovered by William Swainson in 1817 or 1818, he wrote, "The orchids fell in his way, possibly collected in distant parts by some poor fellow who died at Rio. Swainson picked them up and used them to pack his lichens. Thus the myth arose that Cattleya labiata reached William Catley, after whom the genus was named, as packing material for a box of ferns. In fact, William Catley was an accomplished orchid grower known to Swainson, who had deliberately sent the orchid to Catley via the Glasgow Botanic Gardens. According to the Genesee Region Orchid Society, the genus Cattleya was named by the famous botanist John Lindley in 1821. John Lindley was hired by Catley to draw and describe the exotic plants in his collection. In 1821, Lindley published his book, Collectionea Botanica, and the public got their first view of William Catley's favourite plant, Cattleya labiata. However it got here, one thing we know for sure is, by 1821 this beautiful flower was in England, and thanks to Lindley's book, the British elite now knew of and loved it. I've read some theorise that there's something in the symmetry of an orchid that reminds us of a human face, and that's partially what makes it so appealing to look at. That I'm sure is possible, though in my opinion I think the extreme exclusivity of the orchid had just as much of a hand in Orchidelirium as how pretty the flower was. Of course, the Birkin bag or a Bugatti look nice, but I think for most their true appeal lies in how hard it is to acquire one. Orchids grow on every continent except Antarctica, so there was already a little bit of knowledge and experience with them in Britain, but the specific type sent from Brazil was bigger and interestingly grew on trees rather than in the soil. And as previously mentioned, how best to maintain these flowers wasn't exactly known. As written by the Genesee Region Orchid Society, by 1825 Catley had only 2 healthy plants remaining. Out of his extensive collection of exotic plants, he considered C. labiata to be the most beautiful plant he owned. Although John Lindley introduced the world to the beauty of the Orchidaceae, and in particular C. labiata, he was partly responsible for the death of countless orchid species. The prevailing theory of the time was orchids needed a high heat, heavy shade, high moisture, stagnant tropical environment to thrive. Only the most resilient orchid could tolerate these conditions for long, and that advice is probably the fastest way to kill any Cattleya. So yeah, the situation was that orchids were in demand, but the ones that were over here in Britain were dying thanks to incorrect care. And on top of that, who knew what other types were out there growing in the wild? The market demanded more orchids, and so in the service of wealthy benefactors, orchid hunters set sail to far-off lands in search of these prized flowers. We can read about these hunters in the Omaha Daily Bee newspaper, October 9th, 1898. But as a pre-warning, some of the way this article speaks about the people the orchid hunters encountered living in the forests, calling them savages or wild men, is obviously racist, But for the sake of giving you a full understanding of both the Orchid Hunters and how the tribal people were being so offensively characterized at the time, I'll be quoting the newspaper article as written. Orchid hunting. Yearly many go in search of them at inconceivable risk of life and limb. It is like a fairy tale to talk with one of the returned explorers. You hear of trees 300 feet tall, literally covered with orchids, or maybe half a dozen species, each grows in its own distinct zone or altitude. Sometimes a tree is the fetish of the wild men round about. In that case, woe to the sacrilegious outlanders who lay hand or foot upon it. More than one expedition has been massacred for such cause. The destruction of such a tree scattered and dispersed one of the savagest native tribes. Their titular tree stood in a sort of glade. It had been seen by several hunting parties, but none of them dared touch it. When they went home, their accounts of it so wrought upon the fancy of an English collector that he offered an almost fabulous sum for a section of the flower-wreathed trunk. Next year, the Orchid Hunters found the native tribe at war, and taking advantage of the diversion, cut down the tree and sent a segment down to the coast, where, after many trials and tribulations, it was got safe aboard ship, and in the end was the season's wonder of a London conservatory. The native worshippers coming back to find what havoc had been wrought, at once decided that their god had deserted them in anger, hastened to make peace, and ended by going in a mass to live at the other side of the island. Other than human enemies attack the Orchid Hunters. One flower, especially beautiful and one of the most exquisite fragrance, grows only in the treetops, and so high that it is found by scent, not sight. Wherever it grows, it is overrun with ant swarms, red ants, not very large but warlike, with poisonous stings. The minute a tree trunk trembles beneath axe strokes, these ants swarm down and attack the cutters most viciously, often forcing them to suspend work. Then there are serpents, poison insects and vines and herbs as poisonous, to say nothing of panthers, pumas, hurricanes and tropic thunderbolts. Over against them set the pleasures of absolute lordship, the wonderful sights and sounds of the strangely beautiful tropic world, and beyond all that the hope, ever present, ever luring, of stumbling on a new flower, worth many times its weight in gold. Although Brian Milligan, in his article for the Orchid Society's Council of Victoria, does add an interesting thought when discussing the adventurous tales that were reported about orchid hunters. He writes, "New orchids were being discovered every month, the more spectacular examples being reported in the major newspapers of the day. The occasional death of an orchid collector due to misadventure or some exotic tropical disease just added spice to the story. Gradually I have come to realise that some of the colourful accounts that appeared in those times should be taken with a proverbial grain of salt. Yes, the orchid's features, its colour, shape and size, could be taken at face value, but details as to how and where it was found were, for various reasons, not always true. It was not in the best interest of a collector or his employer to reveal the source of any spectacular discovery. To do so would enable rival collectors to procure what was otherwise an exclusive, valuable resource. It was not easy to conceal such information, as many collectors resorted to industrial espionage by bribing their rivals' bearers to reveal the route followed or by following their rivals' footsteps. Back in Britain, some nurserymen deliberately provided misinformation as to where their most spectacular orchids were found. For example, Frederick Sander let it be known that his collectors had found the magnificent Paphiopedilum rothschildianum in New Guinea, a myth that was perpetuated for many years thereafter. Its true source was eventually revealed as the island of Borneo, in particular Mount Kinabalu and its surroundings. But what we can know for sure is that orchid prices did indeed skyrocket throughout the 19th century. We can read articles like this one in the New York Tribune, June 26, 1904, which writes, "There are persons who collect orchids as others do coins or postage stamps, paying large sums for single plants. It is said that a sum nearly twice as large as the largest price paid for a tulip bulb in the time of the famous tulip craze, $5,200, was paid in London last year for one plant, and the stock of another is valued at $10,000. $10,000 in 1904 would be valued around $371,000 today." Also, I discovered a macabre story published in the New York Journal, October 18th, 1896. They write that Joseph Chamberlain, who at the time was the British Colonial Secretary, a notable and powerful political role, spent an eye-watering $50,000 on a particular orchid. $50,000 in 1896 is equivalent to around $2 million today. He did so, beating out offers made by many other notable wealthy men of the time, including Lord Rothschild. And honestly, the price is arguably not even the worst part of the story, because the reason this particular elephant moth orchid, brought back by orchid hunters from New Guinea, was so highly sought after was because it was growing out of a real human skull. In the article in the journal, they explain how the orchid ended up growing in a human skull, and that was because a tribe in New Guinea would apparently place their dead under a tree that bears orchids as part of a funeral, and over time, they say, orchid roots would reach the decomposing body and grow all over it. And eventually you'd be left with a mummified figure covered in the most exquisite flowers. It's quite a beautiful ceremony, if you ask me. As you might imagine, the tribe were reportedly staunchly against any of the bodies being taken by orchid hunters. The journal reports that, quote, "Yet they showed so great an objection to parting with any of their orchid-decked mummies that it took the European orchid hunters nearly 3 years of bribery and negotiation before they could eventually secure a few specimens of the carrion-grown flower." Now, reading what we heard earlier about the immorality of the orchid hunters, personally, I wouldn't be surprised if this isn't entirely the whole story. It's not unbelievable to me that this skull may have been stolen rather than bought from the tribesmen. And actually, to be completely honest, I also wouldn't be surprised if the whole story was just made up by the orchid hunters to increase the value of the orchid they had brought back. I mean, how could you prove where the skull had truly come from? Saying you wrestled it away from tribesmen in New Guinea certainly would have increased its value. Either way, the story was believed, and the orchid was bought by Chamberlain for a frankly insane price. And stories like this of the very rich driving up the price of these simple flowers abound. Over the years, the value of rare orchids just kept increasing. The bubble kept inflating. But like all bubbles, Orchidelirium did eventually burst. And so what burst it? That's quite simple, really. Orchids suddenly became a lot easier to produce, and so the price fell. In 1922, almost exactly 100 years after William Spencer Cavendish, the 6th Duke of Devonshire, kicked off Orchidelirium, American botanist Lewis Knudsen published a paper describing a new method he had come up with to germinate orchids without the use of fungus, which was typically needed in their growth. On account of this, according to an article by Ken Slump on orchids.org, the production of orchids by seed, once very limited, became nearly boundless. Ken also writes, another breakthrough occurred in the 1960s when it was discovered that the growing tip, or apical meristem, of an orchid could be excised and treated in a way that its cells would develop into many identical or nearly identical plantlets. Meristems, or mericlones as these plants are called, enabled growers to produce dozens of copies of their very best orchids. Top quality orchids that once commanded small fortunes for their divisions could now be owned by almost anyone. It's nearly impossible to overestimate the effects these two scientific breakthroughs had on the world of orchids. Orchid species and hybrids could now be produced in a reliably large number from seed, and the best of them could be duplicated until the market was satisfied. These two occurrences combined to drastically reduce the price of quality orchids and democratize the hobby. The idea of the price of a seemingly unremarkable item suddenly skyrocketing and then eventually collapsing back to earth with a thud is a familiar story. From tulip mania to Beanie Babies to NFTs, the price for these items, which actually have no tangible use, suddenly spikes up because people see an opportunity to buy them low today to sell them high tomorrow. And for that to work, there of course needs to be scarcity. And really it seems like often bubbles burst when people realise an item isn't as rare as they thought it was. A lot of the initial success of Beanie Babies was based on the fact that certain ones were retired after a run. This perceived scarcity is what helped fuel the idea that rare ones would someday be worth something. But to quote Vox, the Beanie Baby bubble burst at the turn of the century. The animal spirits, a term coined by British economist John Maynard Keynes, driving the market, fell away. The toys were mass-produced, so beyond those from the earliest generations, few were actually rare. Price declines begat more price declines, and the Beanie Baby smoke, in a way, lifted. This all brings us to a delirium we are currently living through today. You might have noticed that Pokemon cards have been rising in value a lot over the last few years. I was born at the end of the 80s, as proven by this picture of me as a kid wearing a Sonic the Hedgehog top, holding up the Power Rangers toy that I just got for Christmas. So that put me at pretty much the perfect age to fall in love with the first generation of Pokemon cards in the late 90s. I remember very clearly my first run-in with the cards. I'd been off school ill for a little bit, and when I came back in, the whole playground had been overrun with these little cards. Kids flicking through their decks of shiny cartoon monsters saying, "Got, got, and then saying need as soon as they saw one they wanted to trade for. I remember it being sort of like a weird invasion, because I was like, what are these things that now suddenly everyone seems to have except for me? And a really lovely friend of mine explained that this was the new thing that everyone was into, and he hurriedly gave me one of his cards that he didn't want, an Onyx. And this small act of kindness allowed me to feel a little less left out that day. And then of course I quickly went home and spent my paper round money on a pack myself. And the first pack I opened had a shiny Blastoise in it, and I was hooked. And they actually became such a big deal and genuine nuisance in my school that the teachers eventually banned them. And of course, any prohibition just drives the market underground. So me and my schoolmates used to stuff them in our socks to transport them onto school grounds and find some hidden bit of the playground to shuffle through them, making trades like little dealers of illicit products. This is my collection that I found in my mum's garage a little while ago. I don't think the cards here are worth anything much. For one thing, as a kid, I didn't even know there was a mark that meant a card was a first edition, so God knows how many of those I traded away without realising it. But either way, these ones that made it into this binder give me a lot of nostalgic joy to look at. This Dark Charizard I got in a pack that my friend had brought back from a trip to America to give me on my birthday, and he was so jealous when he saw me open it that he borderline wanted to take the pack back. And this Rapidash, another friend of mine who lived close by, posted through my letterbox for me one evening because he managed to trade for it at school, as he knew I'd been searching for one. I don't know how I ended up with these Japanese cards. Someone must have brought them into school, but clearly I went crazy for them and probably traded a lot to end up with this many. There are these laughable fakes, which I must not have realised were fakes when I was a kid. And there's this Meowth, which I got when I went to see the movie in cinemas. Unfortunately, that first Onyx I got isn't in here. Neither is that shiny Blastoise, which was in the first pack I opened. So I guess I traded those away at some point, which is a little sad, but hey-ho. So I guess the long point I'm getting to is these cards hold a lot of sentimental value to me. I just like looking at them because they remind me of some happy times in my childhood. Simply put, looking at them makes me happy. And it's this that makes me so bloody annoyed when I see videos of grown adults buying up all of the modern Pokemon cards just so they can upsell them later. The idea of these scalpers taking that joy away from a kid is just so scuzzy to me. Pokemon cards have managed to buck the bubble trend a bit. This one is yet to burst. I'm guessing that's partly because the Pokemon company has learnt lessons from trends of the past and actually managed to maintain scarcity, limit production of their rarest cards. And also, millennials like me who grew up with Pokemon cards now have the disposable income to spend on them, and we can spend more than we probably should on these nostalgic pieces of card stock, because it's not like we can afford to buy a house. It's sort of a perfect storm, I guess. Also, I've seen people point out that the market really skyrocketed around COVID, with some partially crediting the stimulus checks in America for helping to inflate the bubble. I'm no economics expert, so I can only look at articles and make guesses. I don't know if or when the prices will suddenly plummet, like many Deliriums in the past. But I will say, something interesting came up when I was doing research for this video. This article by Amber V for Automaton from about a month ago, they write, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Pokemon TCG cards soared in value, becoming sought out not only by players and collectors, but also by scalpers and thieves. While premium cards are still selling for exorbitant prices, the speculative boom seems to be dying out in Japan as of recent. Japanese outlet Daily Shincho reports that a large number of Pokemon card shops have been quietly going out of business across the country due to card prices rapidly dropping. The drop in value of Pokemon cards was further driven by the issue of counterfeits, which are becoming increasingly well made and difficult to tell apart from genuine cards. As so-called Pokemon card investors began to exit the market, they caused a domino effect by selling off their collections and effectively reducing the scarcity of cards. All of this seems to have had a beneficial effect on people who actually play the card game, especially kids. Now, that part about the counterfeits is interesting, because as we saw with the Orchids, when it suddenly became easy to make a clone of the flower, the market suddenly became flooded with said clones, and the price plummeted. So it'd be unsurprising if that's what happens here too. To be clear, I'm not predicting the end of Pokemon cards or collectibles, or even expensive Orchids for that matter. They will still hold value. Some of the rarer Beanie Babies still go for a pretty penny. Some Orchids still sell for a lot. And really quick side note, when making this video, I even came across an Etsy store selling these things for extortionately high prices. From the reviews this shop had, I wouldn't personally buy these. Anyway, I'm just saying that history says when you start seeing graphs that go up like these, you can often expect a large value reset at some point. All bubbles eventually burst, and when Orchidelirium lifted, those who had purchased their flowers as a speculative asset would have been ruined, and those who purchased them just because they liked having them and looking at them could still just enjoy having them and looking at them. There's a lesson to be learned there, I think. But I doubt the Pokemon scalpers will learn it. In an interesting combination of our two stories, there's a small orchid that some people on the internet think looks like a Pokemon, the Bee Orchid. I actually commissioned this artwork by the artist Den Parrin of what it would actually look like as a Pokemon, which I think is really cute. So big thank you to them. The links to their socials are in the description of this video. Funnily enough, the Bee Orchid grows in England, and by using the iNaturalist app, in an amazing coincidence, I found that some bee orchids have actually been spotted growing in the wild not too far from where I live. So I decided to go see if I could spot it myself. But the ones that were tagged on the app hadn't actually been spotted for a couple of years, and they don't necessarily bloom every year, so there's no guarantee that they would still be there now. Either way, I and my ever-patient wife headed out to see if we could see one, and it brought back memories to me of the 2016 summer, well before we were married, when we were out in parks playing Pokemon Go, wandering around, following the map on our phones, hoping to find the elusive thing we've been searching for. And eventually, after a good while of searching the area, we didn't find it. But according to a Google search, we were a bit early in the year to be looking for it. It was more likely to bloom a little later in the year. So we weren't that disheartened on our way home. And then a few days after this, we flew out to Italy with some friends for a holiday. And what do you know? When we were out there, I consulted the iNaturalist app, and there were bee orchids supposedly in the area we were staying too. So, as we explored the beautiful parts of Puglia, every flash of pink or purple petals caught my attention. But unfortunately, again and again and again, the thing I spotted wasn't a bee orchid. And after my friends all learned of my mission, being the lovely people they are, they too started keeping their eyes on the ground, looking for this elusive flower. As mopeds and Fiat 500s buzzed past, we inspected every weed that broke through the limestone paved streets. And I couldn't help but think how similar we were to Swainson when he first travelled to Italy, entranced by the amazing flora and fauna that is found here. But sadly, we did not find the bee orchid in Italy either. So we headed home, and I started working on this video again. I was still desperate to find the bee orchid at this point, of course, and I couldn't help but find in myself a humorous comparison to the Orchid Hunters we spoke about earlier, searching for their elusive prize. Obviously though, they were searching for the orchid for business reasons. I, on the other hand, was purely searching for it because this is how I get when I set myself a task. But eventually, after a few more days of inspecting every flower bed I passed, I realised I had to admit to myself, like many other orchid hunters in the past, I'd have to accept that I was going home empty-handed. So, I didn't find the bee orchid, which of course was disappointing. But I will say, as corny as it sounds, weeks of keeping my eyes peeled every time I passed wildflowers, taking in how many gorgeous plants there are growing just everywhere, has been a really rewarding and enjoyable experience. I'd recommend any of you doing the same, and I know it sounds adjacent to touch grass as advice, but genuinely, turning a corner and stumbling across an unexpected, even rare, colourful flower really does remind me of that feeling of surprise you get when you pull a rare card out of a booster pack. And it really does put into perspective how much beauty there is in the world that you can just pass by without noticing. So, with this state of mind, I close the book on trying to find the bee orchid. For about a day. And then me and my wife were like, no, we're going to go find this bloody flower. So we headed out again to another sighting on the iNaturalist app, one a little further away than the last time. And this time, finally, we actually found it.
I think, sadly, this is it.
But sadly, it wasn't in great shape. And after all this time looking for one, to find it in this state was actually sort of heartbreaking. All I could do was hope that as the month went on, these little green bits in the centre would continue to grow. So we said goodbye to the little ailing flower, wishing it all the best, and hoping it would overcome its maladies. And as I finished up this video at home over the next few weeks, and the weather in Britain did what it always does, which is start unexpectedly raining for some reason, I kept thinking about the little bee orchid, which apparently doesn't like damp weather, and hoping it was surviving. And then when everything else about this video was done, I headed out to the bee orchid one more time to see if it had bloomed, or sadly perished. And as you watch this footage of me heading back to the place where I would either find an alive or dead bee orchid, I hope you don't mind me presenting you with a slightly ham-fisted final thought. When all was said and done with Orchidelirium, the hunters had left devastation in their wake. To quote Kew Gardens, unfortunately, 19th century collectors paid little regard to preserving orchids in the wild, and their collecting expeditions frequently plundered forests, causing lasting damage and pushing several species to the verge of extinction. Now, obviously the scale and real-world impact is very different, but this image of the hunters swiping all these treasures and selfishly leaving nothing behind for others does sort of make me think of the videos of grown adults picking the aisles clean of Pokemon cards and similar collectibles. That greedy impulse to muscle in and take everything just because you can and because it'll make you some money, creating a scarceness, driving up the price, and ultimately meaning that the thing you've hoarded can only be owned and enjoyed by the richest, when before that it was accessible to everyone. I don't have the spare money to buy a first edition shiny Blastoise, but even if I did, buying it and having it delivered to my house wouldn't be a tenth of the feeling of that time all those years ago when I opened my first pack and just happened to find one sitting there. That feeling, the surprise of just stumbling across this wonderful thing you've been hoping you'll be lucky enough to find. You simply can't put a price on that. An addendum. I promised you a story about a god, didn't I? In 1704, French garden writer Louis Leger published a book named The Complete Florist. In it, he documents the Greek myth about Orchis, from whom we get the name of the flower we've been talking about in this video. He writes that Orchis was the son of a satyr and a nymph, and he was a crass womanizer, spurred on solely by his libido. Leger writes, "'Twas at the festival of Bacchus that Orchis, like others of the same character, being in drink, committed the most disorderly actions that can be imagined. Being the son of a rural god, he thought he might do anything with impunity, and his brutish passion blinded him so far that he had the insolence to lay hands on one of the priestesses of Bacchus, for which he was punished upon the spot. For the priestess did so incense the Bacchantes or assistants at the festival against him, that they fell upon him and pulled him almost to pieces. And all that his father could attain of the gods was to have him turned into a flower, which was to perpetuate his name, as a lasting stain upon his memory. And that is where we get the name Orchid." Except it totally isn't. This myth, though often repeated to this day, is not recorded anywhere before Louis Leger's 1704 book. It seems like he just made up this story because it sounds about right and echoes some of the myths that are actually from ancient Greece. And the story just sort of stuck. But where the word orchid actually comes from is the Greek word orchis, which means, well, testicles. And that's because this is what the root tubers of orchids look like. And I pass this bit of information on to you in the hopes that if someone tells you the word orchid comes from the name of a Greek god, you can tell them no. It's bollocks. Thank you very much for watching the video. If you liked it, please do like it. If you're not subscribed, I'd very much appreciate it if you could subscribe. When we have the hype feature, which I'm still unsure of what it does, but apparently it's useful, so please hype the video if you can. And also you can become a member if that's something you'd like to do. But for now, that's everything I got for you today. Bye, folks.